I'm going to be talking about Appalachian language today, words and phrases that are used in Appalachia. I'm going to be using the Dictionary of Smoky Mountain English for a reference book, and we're primarily going to focus on words and phrases that start with the letter P. So the very first one is a pack. So of course you think of a pack of dogs. That's the first entry, is a group of dogs kept to hunt game. Maybe you've got a pack of coon dogs. And it goes on and gives a few references for that. But then the second part of pack is to carry a heavy load, especially wild game, on one's back, lug, to convey on the back of a horse, mule, or other animal. And then it also says it's kind of comparable to tote or tussle. 1937, the Hall collection, Cades Cove, Tennessee, just any number of fellers packed grain back there to secluded places in the mountains to make liquor, so they were packing grain back in there. 1937, Wilbur notes, Bradley Fork, North Carolina, when Joe Gunner moved, a wagon would not go above the hill at my father's place. My oldest brother helped pack Gunner's things up to his new home. So we would still use that, and that's one I find that it'd be hard to believe it's not common all across everywhere in the United States. So that if you went on a trip, especially if you were going camping or something into the back country, you might pack your stuff back there. So that one seems pretty common to me. The next one is kind of a play on that pack word, but it's a packsaddle. So a packsaddle is a noun, a large caterpillar having a poisonous sting. And then the only citation it has is 1999 Montgomery collection. It was known by Cardwell. Well, if you've ever been stung by a packsaddle, you will know it. It will be known to you. They really sting. Their sting is different than like think of a wasper or a honeybee or any yellow jacket, hornet, anything like that. It's a different type of sting. I would say it's more like akin to maybe an electric shock or something, but they do hurt. I've been bit by packsaddles. They like to hide in the cornfield, on the corn there in the cornfield, but also my blueberry bushes. They get on them sometimes, and sometimes I'll be picking blueberries and I won't see them, and I'll rub my hand up against one of them, and they hurt. And they're kind of funny looking caterpillars too. They've got like pokey, their hair's all standing up and pokey looking. The next one is a pale, P-A-L-E, is a noun, a stake or slat of split wood, usually riven from a block of wood using a froe or mallet, sharpened at the top and driven upright into the ground in a row, secured by horizontal rails or wire. Hence, paling is a fence or made out of those stakes. Usually the same, it says, as a picket fence. So then it's got a lot of different citations. Let's skip all the way to 1995, historic fences. Paling fences are similar, if not identical, to picket fences. According to one historian, the difference lies in the characteristic vertical stakes with the pointed tops. On paling fences, the stakes or pales were hand split from a block of wood, whereas pickets or picket fences are cut with a saw. Paling fences can be traced to England and were used by the Cherokee in Tennessee as early as 1779. One version where the pales are woven in and out of the horizontal supports can be built without nails. The most common purpose for a paling fence in the Smokies was to keep chickens out of the yard or garden. The pointed pales discouraged the birds from fluttering to the top of the fence where they could perch and then hop down to the inside. A fine example of a paling fence can be seen around the log house at the Oconaluftee Mountain Farm Museum. You don't hear that one as much today. If you said a paling fence, then people would be more likely to know that. But as far as thinking of the individual boards being a pale, that's not one that's very common. This next one is still very common today, and it's a pallet. So it's an improvised bed that is spread on the floor or ground, usually consisting of only a blanket or a quilt. So we would do that when the girls were little. Even now we might say, well, I'll just make me a pallet in the floor and I'll sleep right there. Or which is much better. A pallet's much better if you've got really thick blankets or if you've got something underneath there, a cushion under it. But that one's still very common here in my area. Matt often tells the story of when he would stay with his grandmother Bonnie when he was a little boy. She would make him a pallet in the floor. 1913, Cape Art, our Southern Highlanders. I lay on a pallet on the floor for over a month, so they must have been sick. Hall Collection, Maggie Valley, North Carolina. I started to bed. She had made 4 pallets. They was her and 2 daughters. She made 4 pallets, made a pallet in each corner of the room. I just tumbled down in the pallet and was give out, and in just a minute or two, I was just about asleep. And that was Frank Mahaffey that said that. Will's Hillbilly Dictionary says makeshift sleeping place with bedding laid on the floor. When company filled all the beds, the children slept on pallets, sometimes of straw or in a tick. Sometimes of straw in a tick. So that would have been, like I was saying, a pallet's a whole lot better if you've got something under it, if you've got pillows, or in that case it was straw. 1982, Smokey's Heritage, a rough bed made on the floor. There was an elder lady in my family years ago that I heard her say she suffered a lot with back trouble, and she didn't let it stop her. She just kept on going, but it hurt her a lot. And she just said she found out that sleeping on a pallet in the floor helped her back more than anything else. So, like if they were going somewhere to stay, she said I never had to worry about if they had room or not because I just sleep in a pallet on the floor because that's how I sleep when I'm at home. So I have slept on many pallets in the floor, especially when I was younger, but I certainly prefer the bed. This next one's really interesting. So it's Panther. Panther is a noun, but you'll often hear it said painter here in the mountains of Appalachia. So the common term in the mountains for the mountain lion of or like a catamount it says, but of a mountain lion. So painters would be talking if you heard somebody saying I saw a painter, they would be talking about a mountain lion. There's a lot of different ones about it. Let's see, let's go to 1959, Hall Collection, Hartford, Tennessee. All of the mountain people called the panther a painter. That was Lacey Barnes. 1971, Lindsay and Lindsay, Mammals of Smoky, the largest member of the cat family known to have occurred in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. The mountain lion may also be known as a cougar, a catamount, or a puma. The present status of the panther or painter, as this large long-tailed cat is sometimes called in the southern Appalachian region, is uncertain. Well, it's not uncertain here because you still hear painter. 1976, Lindsay Grassy Balls, my great-grandfather, I guess it was, had an encounter with a mountain lion, rather as he called it, a painter, that raided his barn and tried to carry off a newborn calf. So along with the difference in what you call it, there are so many tales about whether or not people believe that painters, mountain lions, whatever you want to call it, whether or not they're really here. You'll hear people that say that, you know, they're not, and that people that see them, they just see a cat, like maybe a really big house cat, a bobcat, a dog, that they're seeing something else, that they're not really seeing the mountain lion. And then you'll see other people that say, I know what I seen with my own eyes, and you can't, you can't dissuade me from the fact. Well, I'm one of those people that believe they are here. I believe they're rare, but when I was probably in about 8th grade, something like that, so Paul was about 4 years younger than me, so he would have been about in 4th grade, I guess, give or take, and Paul and Pap and I were going to Franklin, and we were going across Franklin Mountain, and I can remember exactly where it was at. Poor Paul, he was in the back seat, I was sitting in the front with Pap. He was bent over in the floorboard tying his shoe had come untied, so he didn't see it. But a painter, a cougar, a mountain lion, whatever you want to call it, ran right across the road, right in front of me and Pap. It was broad daylight, there was no other cars. It was when you kind of get on, if you're familiar with Franklin Mountain, when you're on top of the mountain and it kind of levels out, it was in one of those places, so it wasn't like we had to look a long way away to see it. It just went right in front of the car. And it had a big tail, and it was long, and it was big, and Pap agreed, what he thought it was too, so it wasn't just me with my young, I don't even know if I would have been a teenager then, I guess newly teenage eyes, but I definitely know what I saw, and Pap did too. Another time, when I worked at the college at Tri-County, we had a security guard who was also part of the Cherokee County deputy force, and Harold was his name, and he saw one early one morning when he got there, and buses were just beginning to come in for the early college that was on the campus, and people was just beginning to come to work, but he was there early. It was still dark, and he had a light like they do on their cars, and he saw something, and then he shined his light, and it just stood there, and he seen it. So I definitely knew him well enough that I believe he knew what he saw, and he said it stood there for long enough. It wasn't like it streaked across. It just stood there looking at his light. So I'm one of those that believe. You'll have to tell me if you're one of them, or if you're one of the ones that say, no, you probably just seen a dog or a cat or something like that. Now, right under that one, the next one is funny. It's Panther, or Painter, I guess you would say, but Panther Sweat, and it's illegal homemade whiskey. So moonshine has all kinds of funny names. I need to do a video just about those moonshine names, but that's one of them. Here's one, 1996, Foods and Recipes. Scorpion Juice, Panther Sweat, White Lightning, Corn Squeezins, Moonshine. This powerful alcoholic drink made from corn has had many names attached to it, along with equal parts of myth and truth. So it shares a few other ones there. Now, the next entry is one that I use all the time, and I really confuse people by it. So it's pap. So my father, when I was growing up, my brothers and I called him Daddy. Daddy, that's what we called him. Well, when the first grandchild come along, which was my nephew Ben, he was the first, and Pap, then Pap, my daddy, become a Pap, and Granny, my mother, we called her Mama, she become a Granny. And then after Ben, his brother come along, then Corey and Katie, and then April. So by the time all the grandkids come along, we just all started calling Mama and Daddy Granny and Pap. It just seemed easier somehow. So I confuse people like that. I don't mean to, of course, but in my mind, I don't even think about it. I just call him Pap now. But people say, you mean your grandparents raised you? What happened to your parents? No, they were my parents, and they were Mama and Daddy until those grandkids first started coming along, and then they become Pap and Granny to all of us. So Pap, a father in third-person reference and as a form of address. In Joseph Hall's work in the 1930s, this term was more common than its alternatives. So I find that very interesting. Pap, my daddy, he called his father Pap. He called him Pap. We called him Papaw Wade. We didn't say Wade, he was just Papaw. But Papaw Wade was Papaw to us, but Pap called him Pap. So that's interesting. And that was a tongue twister. 1924 spring, Lydia Whaley. Pap let the county build a schoolhouse free on his land, which was nigh enough for him to go home to dinner, and he was powerful to send us to school. So their Pap really thought education was important. I like that, because there's always the stereotype of people in Appalachia not caring if their kids are educated and not believing in education. So that was all the way back from 1924. 1936, Swain County, North Carolina, Hall collection. Pap was born here in the mountains, but Mother was born in Georgia, and that was Elizabeth Baxter. 1956, Hall collection, Big Bend, North Carolina. Her and Pap and Aunt Nance went over to Slick Rock Branch, and they catched a big wild male hog once, and that was Letha Hicks. 1967, Hall collection, Townsend. Labe and Pap was the ones that killed the bear, and that was Maynard Ledbetter. 1989, Landry, Smoky Mountain Interviews. I called my father Pap and my mother Mammy. 1996, when I was growing up, Pap would always stay away from the upper end of Cades Cove, and that was the Great Smoky Mountain National Park, shared that one. The next one is kind of the one I just mentioned, talking about Papaw Wade, is Papaw, or it could be Paw Paw. I don't hear Paw Paw as much. Maybe it's the way you're saying it, though. I say Papaw, and maybe if you said Paw Paw. So maybe the same thing. A grandfather, though, in third-person reference and as a form of address. 1968, Dare, Paw Paw, a grandfather, and that was Brasstown, North Carolina. So I said I don't hear that as much. But like I said, I think it's how you say. So I was wrong, but I think I say Papaw, Pa, but Paw. It just depends, I guess, on how you say it. And then 1997, Montgomery Collection Pawpaw, known to 9 consultants. 1987, Pawpaw says that he would work from dawn to dark for 50 cents a day or a bushel of corn. That was they were such hard workers and had to compare to us today. Of course, there are still people that work hard today. I don't mean it like that, but I just mean they had such a hard life. And one more kind of in that same vein, pappy, a father in third person and as a form of address, often to express fondness or endearment. So 1924, Pappy's dead and gone, and John Cutshaw's been in the pen for 5 years now. 1937, Hall Collection, shoot him, Pappy, he's a revenuer, he's got shoes on. It says that was a popular saying. That's a strange saying. 1939, Hall Collection, Mount Sterling, North Carolina. Pappy, did you go to school any? And that was Reva Hanna. 1970, Justice. He saw Mammy's bonnet away up front and Pappy in the amen corner, and there was Uncle Tobe from yon side sitting beside him. So those are the difference. You'll have to tell me if you had a pap, a papaw, a pawpaw, or a pappy. This next one's interesting. So it's parcel. When you think of a parcel of land, that's very common to me. But then their variant form is passel. So, and its passel is used to describe a company, well, I mean, I guess it could be parcel or passel, although I've never heard parcel, to describe a company or large indefinite number of people, animal, or things. When years ago, Katie was working with this girl, and I don't remember who they were talking about, some family. The girl was not from here, but they were talking about some family, and Katie said, yeah, well, I know they have a passel of kids, and the lady working with her said, excuse me, and Katie said, I said I know they have a passel of kids, and she said, they have what kind of kids? And Katie's like, you know, a passel. They got a whole lot of them. So she had never heard that. So she's like, oh, okay, I guess I learned a new word today, passel. So let's see what they have. 1889, Broomsedge Cove. I have got a whole passel of guineas. They had guineas. There used to be a whole passel of guineas at the first big white house on my road that I live on. Clarence and Ruby had them, and you'd have to wait for them to get out of the road when you come in. The road was gravel in those days. 1937 Hall Collection, Cosby, Tennessee. He put a passel of corn on an old mule. Neil Phillips. Hans Hawks Dunn, a whole passel of men had gathered themselves together and followed them just to let them know they didn't have any use for their ways. 1962, Dykeman, Tall Woman, you're a kindly passel of folks to share like this, but Lydia's got to have a chance to collect herself. So interesting that usage goes probably goes further back than that, but from 1889 all the way to the 2000s. I don't know what that would have been, like 2017, 18, something like that, when Katie had that conversation with the girl talking about a passel of kids. So it's still alive and well here. If you're particular, I'm interested in this one, knowing this is common across the United States too. Just means that you're very picky and meticulous and requiring special care in the execution. 1937 Hall Collection, Ravensford, weaving and making clothes was a pretty particular job. So we use that too. Like I might say, Corey, whatever, if maybe she's got something of mine she's doing something with, I might say, Corey, be particular with that. I don't want you to tear it up, or I don't want you to break it. We might say it about somebody. He's a really particular person. He don't let his clothes are neat. He don't let one speck of dirt stay on his truck. He is particular about everything. So just being picky, but we say particular. And then right after that is particulars. Now we don't use this one. So it's 1917 Cape Art word list. It meant perishable foodstuffs. So when you're going to dinner on the ground, you better be careful about your particulars. I've never heard anybody use that one. So that one's fell by the wayside and gone. This next one, I just did a video on it a little while back, so I'll link to it, but it's the passion flower, a tall vine, having large flesh-colored flowers and smooth yellow fruit, same as maypop and wild apricot. Now, when I was growing up, I never heard it called passion flower at all. I heard maypop, and then I also heard wild apricot from Pap. That's what he called it. 1937, Thornboro, Great Smoky Mountains. The strange symbolic purple passion flower, the former state flower of Tennessee, grows in profusion, and its fruit is prized by the mountain children who call it wild apricot. So that was like Pap calling it wild apricot. 1970, Campbell, Smoky Mountain wildflowers. According to legend, the parts of the flower resemble the instruments of Christ's crucifixion. The corona representing the crown of thorn, the stamen and pistils, the nails of the cross, the petals and sepals, the faithful apostles. So I've not only heard that comparison to the crucifixion about the flower, just I would say even in the last 2 years maybe that I heard that. I never heard that growing up. 1982, wildflowers. Along roadsides in open rocky places and in old fields where dry conditions prevail, passion flower is a fairly common tendril-bearing vine that may climb to a height of 10 or 20 feet. And then 1996 Montgomery collection says that's the modern name for a wild apricot, and I would agree with that. When I was growing up, I either heard them called maypops, or like I said, Pap called them wild apricots, and they grew all around the edges of his garden. And it's just such a striking flower that you could never see it and not notice it. I mean, it'll be stamped in your memory. It's just such a beautiful, beautiful flower. And the little pods, you can pop them, like if you stomp them. That's why kids love them, because that's the maypop. They may pop if you stomp on them. But they're also edible once they get soft late in the season. Sometimes they'll get kind of a yellow tint to them. I think in other places they get totally yellow, but usually the frost comes here and they just kind of get soft and wrinkly. But when you open them up on the inside, the little seeds, the gelatinous stuff that's around the seeds, that's what tastes really sweet. And lots of kids like to eat those. I've never known of them being like harvested on a large scale where people would put them up for winter use or anything like that, although you can make a tasty drink from them. You can make jelly and puddings and different things with them, so they are definitely edible. And they have a medicinal quality from what I understand. I'm not a doctor, but from what I understand, the leaves, I think even the flower, and of course the little maypop, they have almost like a relaxation. I think one of the entries in here said something about blood pressure, was used to lower blood pressure. The next one's interesting. Patch, a small piece of area or ground distinct from surrounding land by the crop or plant that dominates it. Most often it is a cultivated plot of farmland that may be detached from the main area of farming. See also cane patch, corn patch, and patch farming. So this one's an interesting one. When I grew up, of course, I helped Pap and Granny a lot in the garden. Every year I had to help them. But I learned stuff, and I knew stuff. But it's different when you're doing it all on your own. And once Matt and I were married and we began to garden, I know I drove Pap crazy calling and asking him stuff. But during that time, I become so interested in gardening, growing food for my family, that I started reading and magazines and books and all that. So of course I found out about raised beds. And I remember one day I called Pap and was telling him all about it, and he kind of chuckled and laughed, and I said, "What?" He said, "Tipper, people's been patch farming like that forever. They're just calling it raised beds, but it's really just a little patch." And he said most all the women would always have a little patch of this or that out their back door close to their kitchen so they could access it easy. And he said, and people would, to try to have new ground, to clear extra ground to grow stuff in, they'd start them a little patch of this or a little patch of that, and then next year they'd extend it. And so he said people's been doing that. He got a big kick out of, because I was so excited about the raised beds, like I discovered something new. Of course, the patch farming he was talking about was not enclosed like the raised beds, but it was still kind of the same thing. And I always remember that, how he kind of laughed at me. because like he said, they'd been doing that forever. So let's see what the dictionary says. 1926, Honeycutt, 20 years. Old man Henry said, "We have plenty of meat for tomorrow. Let's hunt the Quill Rose ginseng patch." On his way to Bear Dogs, he went through a patch of sane that looked to be a half acre or more. That was a big ginseng patch. So there they're using it to describe a ginseng patch instead of like the food that I was talking about. 1937 Hall collection, Hartford, Tennessee. I had a patch of land in corn, and the bears got to coming into that cornfield, and that was Bill Barnes. 1939 Hall collection, Proctor, North Carolina. The dogs, they just stove off the road into a little laurel patch, and there they jumped another big one, a bear. So a laurel patch. It goes on, I see a chestnut patch they're talking about. 1956 Hall collection, Cosby, Tennessee. People would make sorghum molasses by the barrelful. The cane patch had to be raised every year. They needed sweetening for bread, and that was Reuben Williamson. I've heard them talk about riding the horses to the ramp patches, filling the tow sacks. That was from Great Smoky Mountain National Park. And then 1982, Powers and Hannah, Cataloochee. I found Uncle Steve and the fellow sitting on top of the bear in a rhododendron patch. 1995, Montgomery collection. He bows up when he catches kids in his watermelon patch. I'd bow up if I found kids in my watermelon patch too. I really love watermelons. Although I might share some with them. So the very next one, patch farming, it mentioned it in the one we just read, is a noun. 1972, Graham County. With the first stages of early clearing, the farmer did patch farming near the cabin. Many farmers today still speak of a patch of corn or other crops. The farmer gradually and systematically extended the patches into wider fields by each year extending his farming into a new area known as new ground. So new ground just means it's ground that you've not used for farming or gardening before. This past summer, Matt and I had new ground on the back side of the greenhouse where we planted for the first time, planted some winter squash. So that entry, though, for patch farming is much more like what Pap was describing to me when the day that he kind of was chuckling at me. And after he told me that, and then I started thinking back about it and thinking about him and Granny, they did do that too. Right here where mine and Matt's house is, it was, of course, all woods in those days. And Pap's big garden, you come out from Pap's house and you had to go off the bank here where our driveway is now and kind of off down another hill, and then there was the big garden. Well, I remember one time before the road was there, so it was just a trail. There's still a trail, but now our road divides the trail from Granny's yard on down to the garden. But I remember at some point along that trail, he made a little patch, a little garden there, a little squash patch. They made a little patch there and planted squash one year. So again, like he was telling me, that was something that had been common in days gone by, still common even in my lifetime. So I love all language from Appalachia, but I love those two examples, like the patch farming, how that day I told him about the raised beds, he's like, people's been doing that. They've got a little patch here and a little patch there, patch farming for years, Tipper. And then the example of the passel of kids with Katie and her friend. I love that those words were used in those days gone by, but that they're still used, today. I just think that's amazing. I love that. Of course, not all words are still used. There's many of them that in this dictionary that I'm not familiar with, I've never heard, that have already fell by the wayside and gone. Some of them because of societal changes, or they're just not in context anymore. And also just because as a society we all are going more and more and more towards sounding alike, where there are beautiful accents, whether it's mine or somebody from New York or New Jersey or California or wherever, they're kind of they're not as common. We're becoming to all sound kind of the same. So I love those words like that. I love the picture in my mind of Katie and the girl's like, what kind of kids, and then Katie taught her a new word and she was excited about it. So I'm plumb foolish about language, if you can tell. I'm sure you can. So I hope you enjoyed hearing me talk about the language today. I hope that you'll leave a comment and tell me which things jumped out at you and which ones you're familiar with, which ones you've never heard. And as always, I hope you'll drop back by often and help me celebrate Appalachia, which for me is a whole lot of talking about our wonderful, rich, colorful language.